Welcome to The Tech Between Us, a podcast that takes a look at the past, present, and future of some of today's most influential technologies. I'm Raymond Yen, your host and director of technical content at Mouser Electronics, a leading global distributor of semiconductors and electronic components. These days, we're hearing about cyber attacks on a regular basis in the news. While we most often hear about complex attacks on utilities, government agencies, or credit reporting companies, most attacks are not committed by malicious state-sponsored actors. In fact, it's the attacks we don't hear about or aren't even aware of that scare me more. With the Internet of Things eventually encompassing tens of billions of nodes throughout our industrial plants, homes, and even cars, hacks against these embedded systems will become more prevalent with even more devastating results. Most of these IoT devices are independent of human interaction, so hackers can pretty much attack at their convenience over an extended period if necessary. An estimate from Fastly states that some IoT devices are attached to the internet for only 6 minutes before being discovered and compromised by hackers. 6 minutes. A good portion of the blame for that resides with owners and users of these devices. Not changing the manufacturer default user ID and password or not patching known threats has led to some crippling botnet attacks by hundreds of thousands of IoT nodes. However, design engineers can also do their part in hardening their products against hacking and tampering. Standard techniques like using a trusted execution environment and performing proper authentication for access to software and systems help guard against many current threats, and major component manufacturers have defenses built in their MCU or dedicated security devices. But it seems like hackers are still half a step ahead of engineers and users of embedded devices, which begs the question, what sorts of threats are on the horizon, and how do we make sure that devices designed to be deployed for years or even decades remain invulnerable to being hacked? To explain ways in which engineers can strengthen the security of their design both today and tomorrow, we're talking with Alan Grau, VP of Sales and Business Development for PQShield. Alan, welcome to The Tech Between Us.
Thanks, Raymond. It's great to be here.
Can you briefly tell us a little bit about yourself and what PQShield does?
Sure. So I've been in the embedded space really for most of my career. I started out in the telecom world at AT&T Bell Labs and Motorola. And, from there, got into the IoT space back before we really even called it IoT. So building embedded devices, and a lot of that was focused around security. And so I've really been focused on embedded system security for the last couple of decades. And I've been with PQShield now for about 8 months. So PQShield is a startup in the security world focused on building post-quantum encryption algorithms, kind of the next generation of encryption algorithms. And so with that, we're targeting a number of different markets, but really heavily focused around embedded devices, IoT devices, and building that next generation of security solutions for those types of systems.
So Alan, in your 2 decades of working with embedded security, you've probably seen all kinds of attacks. What are some common attacks today that engineers should be worrying about on their system?
Well, that's a great question. And really, security in the embedded space has been kind of a slow evolution. When we first started building security into embedded devices and IoT devices, people felt like, well, we've got a connection to this device where we can log in over a telnet type connection. So we'll upgrade that to support SSH. And now we've got great security. And relative to some of the devices at the time, that was true. So there's a lot of legacy devices that have, kind of early first generation security solutions built in, which are quite limited. So, so many older devices are quite vulnerable. They'll often have either weak security or communication that doesn't have strong authentication on it. So it's led to a wide range of attacks. There have been some wildly successful botnets that have taken over large numbers of IoT devices. And again, many of those are exploiting kind of very simplistic approaches because the security is quite weak. There have been others that are, much, much more sophisticated. We've seen some attacks where devices are using an older generation of encryption, and encryption that when the device was built seemed quite strong, but 10 or 15 years later, it's possible to break that encryption, to break the key and decipher the encryption, or to break the authentication and log into the device, quite easily.
Yeah, I know. I mean, there have been some, SHA-1 essentially at one time was considered unbreakable as well as DES. And I think both of them have been shown to be vulnerable.
Yeah, no, so both of those have been deprecated and it's recommended they're no longer used. And, as computing devices get faster and faster, we have to continue to reevaluate our standards in encryption and in security as a whole and build in stronger capabilities.
So to begin with, I mean, I know one of the key factors for security is actually, making sure that whomever is trying to access a system is allowed to access that system, or, the process of authentication. How does an embedded engineer properly authenticate either both the software or a user in their system?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to back up just one step previous to that because, I'd mentioned kind of first generation security solutions in embedded devices or IoT devices, and what I meant by that was, solutions that security solutions that were really kind of point solutions. They tried to address a single problem on the device or a single element of security. So when you look at a more complete security solution for an IoT device, what I really mean by that is, including, what you had just mentioned, strong authentication, including, secure boot in the device so that as the device first powers on, it can validate that the firmware running on the device is what's supposed to be there, that it's from the manufacturer or an approved vendor and it hasn't been tampered with. Strong encryption for the security protocols. And I guess the other piece of that is really just looking at what the overall, use case and attack vectors are for a device and ensuring that, security systems have been put in place to cover the important attack vectors. So the first step really, before we worry about authentication is looking at the entire big picture for a device. What are the likely attacks and how do you build in defenses for those? And then once that's in place, then authentication becomes an important part of that. Authentication is an area where we've seen some successful attacks against IoT devices, either because the device didn't require strong authentication and someone was able to break into the device. So some of the botnets we talked about earlier, or that we briefly mentioned, were able to be successful because you'd see classes of devices that simply had a username and password for authentication, and all devices were shipped with the same default password, and very few people bothered to change them. If you get a smart door lock and my mom's going to take that and have that installed in her house, she's not going to know that she needs to worry about the security of that, she needs to update that, right? Security professionals, we're paranoid. We put strong passwords on everything because we've seen what can happen, but it needs to be very simple, easy to use, and not, default to weak security. So the problem is then you've got a default username and password that, is probably on a user manual that's, available on the internet that hackers can find and read, or they can reverse engineer the code and find that. And then they can build a botnet or, some sort of an attack that then propagates across those devices, finds all the devices using that same username and password. And suddenly that weak authentication allows a very broad scale attack.
Right, and because it sounds like this could be replicated over and over again across multiple embedded systems from that same company, assuming, like you said, that it's a default password somewhere.
And by multiple, we're often talking tens of thousands of devices in many cases, right? So these become very large botnets very quickly.
Right. Yeah, I remember what was the most recent one? I think it was the, if I'm correctly pronouncing it right, the Mirai botnet.
Yeah, so the Mirai's, that's probably the most well-known, botnet. It was extremely successful, and there were several variants of that. And it's been a while since that came out, and I'm trying to remember the numbers. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I believe there were hundreds of thousands of devices that were compromised.
Yep. Yeah, that's what I remember as well. I mean, just this vast army of bots, doing somebody's bidding.
Yeah, and with that sort of the number of resources available, they were able to start some very, very successful distributed denial of service attacks and other attacks that were quite effective.
The Optiga Trust M IoT Security Development Kit from Infineon is the easiest way to develop and evaluate end-to-end security use cases for your IoT devices. It is delivered with 2 out-of-the-box security use cases: secure communication with Amazon Web Services over MQTT, and secure zero-touch cloud provisioning using Cerent Cloud ID. Learn more by visiting mouser.com/Infineon.
But that brings us back to your point of, how do we address authentication? That is really one of the fundamental, security principles that designers need to be concerned about. Every device on the network, you need to know who it is. It needs to be able to identify itself, and that needs to be done in a way that's cryptographically strong and can't be easily defeated or counterfeited.
And the topic of cryptography is obviously key, one of the fundamental key principles of any kind of security, whether it be authentication or encrypting data before it's stored into memory and things like that. How strong are the current cryptographic methods?
That's not an easy question to answer because there's no simple, straightforward answer. Part of it depends upon what exactly you mean by the current cryptographic algorithms. But the big picture answer to that is that the current cryptographic approaches are strong against current attacks. And what I mean by that, and this gets into what PQShield is focused on, is researchers are working very hard and making very rapid progress in the development of quantum computers. And quantum computers are going to fundamentally change the security landscape. Now, the time frame for when that happens is debatable, but everybody, all of the experts tend to agree that it'll be sometime this decade that a quantum computer will be able to break RSA and ECC encryption, the current asymmetric encryption algorithms.
Right. I know a lot of embedded security products are based on the elliptical curve cryptography methods. So we're saying that as quantum computers become more viable, I guess is a good word to put it. Those are going to be. Would you say they're going to be obsolete, or would you say that they're just simply going to be better methods of protecting our systems?
Yeah, I would say that they will be. The encryption methods will need to be deprecated and replaced, and systems that continue to use the older encryption methods will be vulnerable, and there'll be known attacks that really only can be mitigated by migrating to the next generation of encryption algorithms.
Yeah, because it always seems that, you hear it in the news, hackers always seem to be that half step ahead of design engineers when it comes to things like security. There are always new types of attacks, new ways to crack even secure systems, and what we're talking about here is using quantum computers. That seems to be kind of the frontier of security.
Yeah, no, hackers are very clever, right? And the challenge is, the hacker needs to find one weak link often to break into a system. So you can have, multiple different, methods of trying to secure a system, and, any single vulnerability, can often allow a hacker to defeat the system. So it is a big challenge, and hackers do often seem to be one step ahead. And they're certainly very good at finding that weakest link, or the kind of the low-hanging fruit, if you will, that can be attacked. But quantum computing, the distinction there is, today if somebody breaks into a system, it's rarely because they've broken the encryption, or if it is, it's because they're using the device is still using an obsolete encryption algorithm. So very few. Well, let me say that differently. I don't know of any successful attack on a computing system that found the root cause to be breaking the fundamental encryption algorithm when strong encryption algorithms were used. Now, sometimes people have broken encryption because even though the encryption algorithm is strong, the implementation had an error in it, or they used. They didn't have enough entropy when they created keys, so hackers were able to guess the keys. So people have been able to attack encryption algorithms by breaking the implementation, even though the algorithms are theoretically still too strong to be broken by current computers.
So there really is a distinction between the algorithm itself, whether it's RSA or elliptical curve, and the way an engineer implements it on their system with different types of random number generators, different key generation methods.
Absolutely, right. So, and that's true of other systems as well, right? I mean, you can have a protocol that's well designed, but if somebody implements something wrong, then suddenly the protocol has a problem with it. And many security issues are implementation issues. But with quantum computers, what's changing is quantum computers will be able to break RSA and ECC. And what that means is that they'll be able to take the public key and from that derive the private key. Something that can't be done with current computing technology. And if you can do that, you can essentially take over the algorithm. You can impersonate whoever it was that has the private key. You can decrypt information that's supposed to be secret. So the authentication schemes break down. The key exchange mechanisms, the signature algorithms, all of those things break down and can be defeated.
So really with quantum computers, it's letting hackers literally brute force their way into breaking security as opposed to just trying to find, like you were saying earlier, a hole or a mistake in the implementation. They don't care whether there's a hole or a mistake. They just flat out just put computing horsepower or or the equivalent of quantum computing horsepower behind it and just say go.
Exactly. And so that's what, the industry has been starting to look at. So NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology in the U.S., started a process, I think it was in 2015 when they first kicked off the discussion of, hey, we need to create new standards, new algorithms that will be safe in a quantum world, that will not be easily broken by quantum computers. And so that process started then. It kicked off in earnest in 2018 when they started having engineers and researchers submit algorithms for evaluation. And so through that process, they've gone through 3 selection rounds and are at the very, very final stages of that now where standards are starting to be produced.
Now, are these standards simply variations of current RSA and ECC implementations, kind of like going from DES to triple DES? Or are they truly new algorithms that can't be, I guess, let me think of the best way to say this, that aren't possible with systems today?
Great question. So they are new algorithms, but there's a couple of things that are important to understand in this process. So first off, quantum computers are really good at certain things, but they're not simply faster computers. They're not just supercomputers. So they're really good at certain things, but relatively weak at other problems. So they're really good at factoring prime numbers, which allows them to break RSA. An elliptic curve discrete logarithm problem is the hard math problem behind ECC. And they can also solve that because that can be viewed somewhat as an equivalent or cast as almost an equivalent to factoring prime numbers, allowing quantum computers to break that. But there's other math problems that they're not good at. So these new algorithms that have been submitted by researchers and that NIST is going to be standardizing are based upon using different mathematical techniques rather than prime numbers or the elliptic curve discrete logarithm problem. So it's different mathematics in the algorithms. So they're different algorithms, but they are algorithms that can still run on traditional computers. So we don't need a quantum computer to create quantum safe encryption. We can do quantum safe or post-quantum encryption on a traditional computer just using different mathematics in the algorithm.
So the new algorithms are tailored specifically for attacks using quantum computers. What if somebody were to try to attack these using just standard computing that we have today? Would it still be next to impossible, or are there ways that today's computers, our standard PCs and servers and whatnot, could crack those algorithms where a quantum computer couldn't?
Yeah, so the algorithms are designed to be safe from attack from both traditional computers and quantum computers. So yeah, that's absolutely an important part of the process.
Now, I mean, yeah, you said that these algorithms have been submitted. How close are we to seeing some new standards coming out of NIST?
So there's actually two algorithms that were standardized a couple of years back for a very special use case. They're used for essentially code signing or can be used for document signing. So they're hash-based digital signature algorithms. So we do actually have some standards, but they're not applicable for kind of general replacement for RSA and RSA and ECC for all use cases. So we do have some standards in place with those two algorithms, but then NIST has said that they expect to be announcing the winners of what they're calling the round 3 competition literally any day now. So we were actually expecting to see that last month, but they're still working on some of the final details. So I would expect, hopefully this month that we'll see the first set of algorithms to be standardized, and then there'll be another round, at some point after that where they add some additional algorithms. And then the expectation is once they make these announcements, we'll have algorithms that are very close to being standardized. It'll take a couple of years to work through all the kind of the full documentation of the standards. So there may be some tweaks to the algorithm over the next couple of years, but we will be at a point where we can start implementing systems that are using algorithms that will be standardized. And if the standards are tweaked in the next couple of years, it'll be an easy firmware update to allow those algorithms to be tweaked to match any changes in the standard. So we're very, very close is the answer.
So it sounds like we're within a couple of years, it sounds like something is available today, but we're really within a couple of years, of having, some more robust standards, some of the more, forward-looking standards. And you actually bring up a good point, Alan, when you mentioned, firmware updates. So as we mentioned at the top of the conversation here, some of the systems that we're working with are designed to be deployed for decades, especially in some of the industrial areas. How would an engineer design a system such that it could be, implemented today using current RSA and ECC techniques, and then be upgradable to some of the post-quantum techniques that you're describing?
Well, there's a couple of different approaches. I mean, we do have algorithms available today that are standardized for code signing, so those can be used for secure boot and platform security. And then the other question companies need to ask is how critical is it that they be compliant with standards? And the answer varies. If you're looking at platform security, right, basically how does an IoT device protect the platform itself so that it can't be hacked, right? So that's things like secure boot and the secure firmware update capabilities. You can start building a secure boot and secure firmware update solution using post-quantum crypto algorithms today and deploy that system. And then, once that's in the field, like you say, if you're building a satellite communication system that's going to be in the field for the next 3 decades, well, a year from now or 2 years from now, you could update your communication protocols in a way that is secure because you've got the post-quantum security around the firmware updates and the platform security. And then with that update, you could update your communication protocols to support post-quantum algorithms. So one way to get started is addressing platform security. And in that case, even if what you build isn't completely compliant with standards, that's less of an issue because it's a closed system. It will still be post-quantum secure, but then you can upgrade your communication protocols in a couple of years in a way that's compliant with standards, because there it's more important for interoperability that you be compliant with standards.
As long as if a system is designed to be closed, not really interacting with something, they could really go out and put in the post-quantum security today, and still maintain other levels of security for the current secure communication channels until those new standards are ready. Exactly,
and people are doing that, right? Companies are starting to adopt this technology, right? They know the standards are very, very close. And we've kind of alluded to this a couple of times, but one point that's also quite important to make is the devices we're building today, in many cases, will still be in the field 20 years from now. So whether quantum computers are able to break these encryption algorithms in 6 years or 10 years, which is kind of the range people are saying, is irrelevant. If you're building a product that's going to be in the field for 20 years, you need to start looking at this now and be concerned about it today.
Exactly. Build in that flexibility for upgrades and to future-proof those designs.
Exactly.
Does quantum computing affect things like, using trusted execution environments? I assume all those techniques will still apply to future designs as well as current designs.
Yeah, no, those are still absolutely important, right? I mean, you have to protect your private keys. I mean, that's one of the things that trusted execution environments help support in TPMs and other similar technologies. They allow, we talked about design flaws being used by hackers to compromise systems. Well, with a trusted execution environment, you can keep your security capabilities, your security protocols, and your encryption algorithms and other highly sensitive, highly secured components within that trusted world, right, that's isolated. So a good example would be, a set-top box or an iPhone where you have all sorts of downloadable apps, right, that can be added to the device. If somebody compromises that app, they're not able to break the overall system because the system security components are running within that trusted execution environment or some other isolation environment. And so those things still provide a lot of value and will still exist. Global Platform, for example, is working on kind of next generation standards, and that's something that we're working with them around, is how do they extend their APIs for a trusted execution environment to enable support for post-quantum encryption algorithms alongside of what they currently support.
As we proceed to a post-quantum world, there will be changes and modifications to existing trusted execution environments, but the concept will still remain viable for overall security.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. From PQShield, I assume PQ stands for post-quantum. How are you guys involved in creating some of these new algorithms or implementing some of these new algorithms?
Yeah, so absolutely. PQShield does stand for post-quantum. And so our company, we got involved, very early on in the NIST process in helping to evaluate algorithms. We actually have a large number of cryptographers on our staff. Several of the post-quantum algorithms being evaluated by NIST were submitted by our team, or our team as co-authors on those. So we've been very, very heavily involved in that activities. We've actually implemented all of the NIST round 2 and round 3 algorithms. So everything that made it to round 2, we've implemented. And part of that was to help in the evaluation process with NIST to allow, an implementation that would show the strengths and weaknesses of a given algorithm and so on. As we've moved into round 3 and we're very close to having commercial solutions and having standards, we've built both software SDKs implementing all of the NIST round 3 algorithms, as well as hardware IP that can be used to implement most of the round 3 algorithms in hardware. There's a few of the algorithms that are not well suited for hardware implementations, but for those that are well suited for hardware implementations, we have hardware IP designs that can be implemented in a custom ASIC or an FPGA. And so we're using those products, the hardware products and the software products, to enable companies that are building kind of the next generation of security platforms to start incorporating post-quantum crypto into their platform security, their root of trust systems, their secure communication algorithms, and their authentication systems, all of those components.
Yeah, when you mentioned hardware implementations, you answered my question, but I was thinking, okay, is this down at the ASIC or the FPGA level? And yes, it is. So a designer can simply, take the IP. I don't know if they're soft cores or hard cores, but they just drop them into a design, and they are going to be compliant with some of these. Will be compliant with some of these new standards.
Yeah, and you're right. It's all of those things. So there are soft cores that can be run in an FPGA. It can be implemented as a hard core in an ASIC. And one of the other things that we haven't touched on is the concept of side channel attack resistance. So when you look at encryption systems, there are ways that attackers are able to try to monitor things like RF output, how long it takes operations to perform, power consumption, and things like that can leak information and allow hackers to discover key material. And so those are all called side channel attacks. So when you start building crypto systems, especially in hardware, you need to start looking at side channel attack resistance. And that's another area that we've been very focused on. So with our solutions, we have built-in side channel attack resistance, which is really where you start to get from the NIST academic research on what algorithms would be safe in a post-quantum world to how do you actually implement this in a practical way in a system that's going to be used in a highly, highly secured environment where you're going to have potentially nation-state attackers who are going to employ any and all mechanism to try to break the device and have very sophisticated resources, right? A lot of time and effort that they can throw at it with very skilled resources. So having those highly hardened, highly capable solutions is really critical.
Right. So you're designing for, attacks from, like you said, global, state-sponsored attacks, not just, the guy in his mother's basement hacking away on a PC.
Exactly. And if you look at quantum computing, right, the first people to have access to those, it's not going to be the script kiddie in the basement. It's going to be the nation-state adversaries going after extremely critical assets.
I don't know if IBM will actually access it for that, but I think I can actually, sign up for time on one of IBM's prototype quantum computers. I'm not exactly sure how that works, but I think I can actually do that.
Yeah, no, IBM is definitely one of the leaders in this space, and I know they do have a service available now commercially. It's very early days, of course. But researchers are making quite rapid progress with these things, and the capability is going to only continue to increase.
I guess before we close, is there anything that anything else that you'd want to mention, about security in general, or post quantum in particular?
Well, I think the message in security is always vigilance and diligence, right? You have to not just think things are going to be okay, because you will be attacked. And if you don't know you've been attacked, then that just means you probably aren't paying attention or don't have the right defenses in place. And post-quantum is really no different, right? I think these attacks are coming, and it's easy to say, well, it's going to be the end of the decade. That's a long time from now, but it's going to get here more quickly than people think, and it takes a long time to replace all the crypto systems. If you think of everywhere that encryption is used today, it's extremely pervasive, and starting to replace those devices, replace the systems, replace all the infrastructure that's using encryption is a process that's going to take a lot of time. And so it's important that people at least start educating themselves, start thinking about a roadmap. And depending upon the type of product you're building, you may need to get really aggressive about building security in. If you're building a highly critical, highly safety critical, or anything that is going that is going to be used for a long time and is a high target, you probably need to think about building post-quantum crypto in sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and the list of systems that are requiring that is growing. I've heard medical infrastructure is now a key target for some of these guys that I would have never guessed, but that is starting to become a larger and larger target.
Yeah, no, all of them are. In the long run, right? Hackers are very good at finding the weak link, and if you're the last one to update your system, then you're going to be the first one that hackers are going to be going after. But it's a big problem, but it's a problem that can be solved. The advantage of post-quantum crypto, these encryption algorithms, is we don't have to replace the infrastructure. We can still use the same internet. We can still use the same protocols. We can still use the same devices. We just need to replace the underlying encryption that's used by those devices.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like it's a lot of firmware updates and updating down the road.
Yeah, and there's a lot of work to be done, but it's, we've got a great start on it. NIST has done an amazing job in putting together standards, and the infrastructure and the capability will be there.
So we've been talking today with Alan Grau, Vice President of Sales and Business Development for PQShield. Alan, thanks for walking us through some current attacks and giving us a really good look at what's coming down the road for security. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Tech Between Us. Remember, this podcast is just one part of our original and ongoing content series, Empowering Innovation Together. You can find videos, articles, and more on designing for security at mauser.com/empowering-innovation. And don't forget to join us for our next episode when we talk driver monitoring systems.